Hello, and welcome to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's weekly Ask an Atheist program. My name is Rebecca Markert, and I'm FFRF's legal director.
And I am Liz Cavell, one of FFRF's attorneys.
And I'm Ryan Jane, another attorney at FFRF. Today's topic centers around two annual spring state church complaints we receive: the National Day of Prayer and prayer at graduations, along with other end of the school year events. If you have questions for us today, you can post in the comments below or submit your questions to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
So we're going to get started with the National Day of Prayer. Tomorrow is the National Day of Prayer. This is a day that was created in 1952 after Reverend Billy Graham led a 6-week-long crusade in Washington, D.C. That tour ended with a speech in which he called for a National Day of Prayer. He stated in that speech, quote, "What a thrilling, glorious thing it would be to see the leaders of our country kneeling before the Almighty God in prayer." The next day, Representative Percy Priest introduced a bill creating a National Day of Prayer in the U.S. House of Representatives. Then, Senator Absalom Robertson, father of Reverend Pat Robertson, introduced the same bill in the Senate, saying it was a measure, quote, "against the corrosive forces of communism which seek simultaneously to destroy our democratic way of life and the faith in an almighty God on which it is based," end quote. The bill was passed and signed into law by President Truman. It was amended in 1988 when Vonette Bright, founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, lobbied Congress to cement the National Day of Prayer as the first Thursday in May. President Ronald Reagan signed the bill into law, and it currently reads, "The President shall issue each year a proclamation designating the first Thursday in May as a National Day of Prayer, on which the people of the United States may turn to God in prayer and meditation at churches, in groups, and as individuals." Every president has issued a proclamation since this law was first enacted, and in fact, all 50 governors have issued proclamations as well.
Since 1989, the National Day of Prayer Task Force, which is housed in the headquarters of Focus on the Family, has written presidential proclamations with a yearly theme and scripture verse. Presidents, governors, and other public officials have often used the National Day of Prayer Task Force wording or themes. This evangelical Christian group, the NDP Task Force, exists to, quote, "mobilize the Christian community to intercede for America and its leadership in the 7 centers of power: government, military, media, business, education, church, and family," end quote. It organizes prayer gatherings and events across the country for that date, which are, in their own words, specifically limited to the Judeo-Christian heritage and those who share that conviction as expressed in the Lusam Covenant. I think I'm saying that correctly. And that covenant includes things such as that the Bible is, quote, "the only written word of God, without error in all that it affirms," and that, quote, "there is only one Savior and only one gospel." Coordinators, volunteers, and speakers at the NDP Task Force events must share these views in order to participate. Many divisive incidents have occurred because of the exclusion of Jews, Muslims, and even other Christians from these events. In one instance, an FFRF member named Doug Marshall, who's a citizen of Warren, Michigan, went to one of these events, and he, without saying anything, this was at City Hall, was holding up a sign that read, "2 hands working will do more than 10,000 hands praying. Stop wasting time, do something that is really worthwhile." He, just for standing there and holding that sign, was forcibly removed via police escort. So that is how exclusionary these events are. And ironically, this year's theme is Pray for America, Unity, based on Ephesians 4:3, which purportedly challenges all of us to mobilize unified public prayer for America, quote, "making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace."
So you may be wondering how a law passed by Congress exhorting Americans to engage in prayer can be constitutional. The First Amendment, after all, states, "Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion." The short answer is it's not. In fact, in 2008, FFRF brought a legal challenge to the National Day of Prayer and sued then President George W. Bush and then eventually Obama over the annual proclamation. In April of 2010, U.S. District Court Judge Barbara Crabb ruled in our favor and found the law unconstitutional. In her well-reasoned decision, she said the First Amendment bars the government from enacting a day of prayer, just as it would prohibit it from enacting a day of blasphemy. She also wrote, quote, "It bears emphasizing that a conclusion that the Establishment Clause prohibits a government from endorsing a religious exercise is not a judgment on the value of prayer or the millions of Americans who believe in its power. No one can doubt the important role that prayer plays in the spiritual life of a believer. However, recognizing the importance of prayer to many people does not mean that the government may enact a statute in support of it, any more than the government may encourage citizens to fast during the month of Ramadan, attend a synagogue, purify themselves in a sweat lodge, or practice ruin magic." The government appealed this decision to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago, and a year later, the three-judge panel ruled that FFRF and its non-believing co-plaintiffs did not have standing to challenge the law. Judge Easterbrook wrote for the court and noted that while proclamations are intended to reach all citizens, our plaintiffs didn't have injury to sue because nobody was forced to pray.
But it's important to note that the Seventh Circuit only ruled that we didn't have standing to sue. They did not reach the merits of the case, which means the National Day of Prayer has not been ruled constitutional because, frankly, it's not. So FFRF still makes complaints about the annual Day of Prayer and the events organized around it each year. These events take place at all levels of government in many different locations. Every year, FFRF sends letters to elected officials who participate in the evangelical ceremonies and to cities and towns who are more involved in organizing, coordinating, and sponsoring them. Our attorneys have already been busy evaluating complaints this year and have sent letters across the country asking mayors to not participate and cities and towns to cease sponsorship of National Day of Prayer events. For example, our colleague Colin McNamara sent a letter to Bell County, Kentucky last week. A National Day of Prayer event will be taking place at the county courthouse tomorrow, led by the Bell County Judge Executive and the Mayor of Pineville, Scott Maiden. The advertisements for the event, county employees were listed as points of contact, and government resources, including telephone numbers, were used for coordination. There's no mistaking that the county endorses this religious event, and that violates the First Amendment.
So the National Day of Prayer is one of the complaints we handle at this time of year. Across the country, schools are ending their academic years and will be receiving complaints about religious intrusions at the end of year school activities.
Right. So, in the public school context, the most common complaints we receive this time of year involve prayers at graduation ceremonies and school promotion of baccalaureate services. So, first, a little background on graduation prayer. Most people know what we mean here, but these are complaints, and we're usually hearing, unfortunately, about them after the fact, when a graduation ceremony has already taken place. But this is where a public school graduation ceremony program includes a scheduled prayer. And there's a Supreme Court case explicitly holding that it is unconstitutional for public schools to schedule prayer as an official part of a graduation program. So this is a violation whether or not the prayer is led by a student or a faculty member or an outsider, such as a member of the clergy. The key issue is not who leads the prayer, but whether or not the prayer is an official part of the program. So the very obvious, most obvious signal of that is when you've seen it scheduled on the written program. So the program explicitly indicates an invocation or a benediction or some other prayer is part of the ceremony. Or you're attending a graduation ceremony where a speaker is introduced for the express purpose of leading the prayer. So now to lead us in prayer, little Timmy Smith will come to the stage. So something that indicates that it's a scheduled part of the ceremony, not a spontaneous, part of a speaker's speech. So there might be a situation when a student speaker at a graduation ceremony who is selected to speak for some secular reason, such as they're the valedictorian or they're the class president, or something like that. That person may spontaneously and without the involvement of school officials include some kind of religious remarks in their speech or even a prayer in their speech. But that's rarely what we hear being reported. And that's rarely what is taking place when someone hears a prayer being delivered at a public school graduation. And even though the Supreme Court has clearly ruled on this, this is still actually a very common complaint. And every single year we hear reports of public school graduations that open or closed or both with a prayer that was listed on the printed program or that was otherwise clearly a scheduled part of the official ceremony.
And I have a couple examples to show of this that I've written on. So first, here's a program for the graduation at Wasco Union High School in California. And you can see that it lists invocation as part of the program. There it is. So there's no doubt that the school has planned on having a prayer at this school event, and that's a violation. Another more bizarre example that I wrote on last year was in Springs Valley Community Schools in Indiana, where they had a prayer listed in a kindergarten graduation. To state the obvious, this was not a kindergartner's idea. Now, most people are generally aware that graduation prayer is a common thing and what to look out for, but not as many people are familiar with baccalaureate services. Baccalaureate programs are actually just religious services that traditionally take place before a graduation. They're often held in a church, and they're basically like worship services. Sometimes it's a Catholic Mass, sometimes a more non-denominational Christian service, but that also honor graduates. Graduates usually wear their caps and gowns to these events, and these religious services obviously cannot be hosted by school districts themselves because they're religious services. So when we hear from someone in a school that is actually hosting one of these events, that's a clear constitutional violation. But even when a private parent group or a church is actually hosting and organizing the baccalaureate, there's a whole spectrum of school involvement that we still hear about that raises constitutional problems. We most commonly hear reports of schools that promote the baccalaureate services right alongside all the other senior activities and graduation events on the school website, on senior class handouts and announcements, etc. And by promoting the baccalaureates as just another senior class graduation activity, along with a bunch of other school-sponsored activities, the school gives the impression that it is at least endorsing the event, and often graduating students think that their school expects them to attend. Now, I have a few examples of baccalaureate violations to show as well. First, here's a poster that Meridian CUSD in Illinois allowed to be hung up inside its school. You can see a few things. So it advertises a baccalaureate that takes place in the high school gym. Faculty are invited, and on the top of the poster, words like school, teachers, coaches, and counselors are there right along with pastors, all pointing at the word offerings, which is apparently the religious theme of the event. All of this taken together suggests that the school endorses the event when this poster is hanging in the hallway along with advertisements for other graduation events. Here's another one. This is a web page for Warwick Valley High School in New York. The title of the page is Important Graduation Information. It lists the commencement ceremony, other graduation details and requirements, and then in bold, it advertises a baccalaureate at a local church. The school lists separate pickup times for caps and gowns for students who will attend the baccalaureate and reminds students that they are expected to wear their gowns to the baccalaureate. It's important to point out it does not matter that the school, in this case, does say that the event is optional. By promoting it in the way that it does, the school is endorsing the event, and it's presenting it as an event on equal footing as the commencement ceremony. Now, finally, here's a graduation schedule for Kanawha County Schools in West Virginia. You can see the highlighted portion, the baccalaureate info is mixed right in with everything else. And this one not only fails to say it's optional, but it even says, please join us for this wonderful event. Can you imagine the outrage if a school listed an atheist, Islamic, or satanic event in the same way? all these schools seem to think that it's okay to promote these events because they're Christian, which of course is precisely the problem. The government can't have a preferred religion.
So we do get a lot of these complaints this time of year, spanning from May until the middle of June. And now I'd like to take some questions from our audience about these two topics. So the first one goes back to the National Day of Prayer, and is an interesting one. Liz will appreciate this. She used to be our intake attorney. We got to field a lot of these types of questions. So Corey Melton asks, how does American government-led prayer compare to other countries around the world? Do most nations subscribe to opening their meetings with such nonsense? I mean, I think it kind of depends. The U.S. is unique in having an establishment clause and having the separation of state church in our Constitution, and that doesn't exist in other countries around the world. But are you guys familiar with any situations such as these?
I mean, the short answer is definitely that we don't really have any expertise in the the constitutional restrictions on religion and government of other countries, and that the U.S. Constitution is unique in its in the way that it separates explicitly secular government from religion. Many countries, even most first world countries, do have some sort of established religion or a state-sponsored religion, so it's a really different question. Although I will say, given the demographics, there are definitely people in other countries, even with a state-sponsored religion, who object so strongly to being exposed to religion at government events, and they reach out to us kind of saying, hey, can you do what you do in Canada? Because we're hearing complaints about so much religion and Catholicism in the public school system in Canada, and it's hard because we really aren't working with the same constitutional tools, and oftentimes there is no constitutional basis on which citizens of other countries can object to government sponsorship of prayer or just religion in general.
Yeah, and I'd add that, in Western Europe at least, there's kind of a different path that they took to get to a similar place, where they don't have this constitutional tool to say that their founders decided to keep government and religion separate. In fact, it's often, like you said, very much the opposite, where they have an official religion, but they are far ahead of the United States in terms of just demographically moving away from religion. So if they do have a prayer, it's, I think, more likely to be seen as genuinely just ceremonial, and it's like, God save this honorable court, and here we go. And no one thinks that's actually supposed to be invoking a deity. So it's kind of the demographic shift, I think, got them to a place where they at least don't have the kind of prominence that we do. That's an incredibly broad statement. There are, I'm sure, plenty of exceptions to that. And of course, outside of Europe, there are plenty of theocracies and whatnot where it's very, very different, where religion plays a major role.
Well, I agree with you. Having lived in Germany for a number of years and meeting people who live in Europe, one of my best friends is from France, and I recall telling her about my current position and the types of cases that I work on, and her saying, that would never happen here. But just last week or the week before, I read that in the state of Bavaria in Germany, they're putting up Christian crosses on all of the municipal buildings.
I saw that too, yeah.
So kind of interesting that they're getting this wave too. But I feel like there is the demographic shift, and there probably will be a backlash over that.
Although I saw that there was I think a cardinal who came out against that in Bavaria.
Really?
Yeah, and so that's something you sure
interesting.
wouldn't see in this country.
Right.
We are getting off topic though. So, but interesting stuff. So another question goes to school prayer. Heather James asks, what if a prayer wasn't scheduled ahead of time? At my college graduation, we had a person who was the CEO of a local company giving opening remarks. Then suddenly he started leading a prayer and calling my college's town, God's country, which really irritated me. Is that constitutional?
Well, two issues there. One, you're at the college level where, just to oversimplify, the federal courts have not even been as prohibitive of religious content, even scheduled religious content at the college level. the law is really, really strong at the elementary and secondary school levels because courts have recognized that students at that age and grade level are exceptionally impressionable. That's such a coercive peer environment and just power environment in terms of the way students see teachers and see the power of the district. So at the college level, already you're sort of in a little bit of a less strict establishment clause framework, and in a situation where a scheduled speaker, assuming that whoever that business person was selected to speak for some other criteria, they're an alum or they're an honorary person and they're going to give the commencement address, and then it just totally like derails off into some crazy offensive religious stuff or prayer or whatever it is. That is probably something that would be hard to challenge as a constitutional violation that's attributable to the college, assuming, of course, that when you scratch the surface, it wasn't, encouraged by the college or it wasn't scheduled as a religious talk by the college. And we've definitely seen flat out religious scheduled speeches and prayer at the college level, and we do complain about that. Even if the law is not as strong. But I will say that at the college level, it's such a unique environment. Yes, it's not as coercive, the students aren't as young, so maybe the law is not as strong, but the policy considerations and the sort of the wind that you can get at your back as an activist or just a disgruntled student who's complaining is really strong because it's a really pluralistic environment. There's international students. It's really, really not the place for sectarian religious, rah-rah at a public college graduation.
Yeah, and I would just add that you even though the college has some arguments that you were talking about that a high school wouldn't have, if there were to be some sort of a trend of this, that would be a different story, right? If this happens one year and then the college says, oh, that was great, why don't you come back next year and give the commencement again, and then the same thing happens, it starts to look like, okay, the college knows what's going on here. And so at some point, an objective student is going to realize that the school really is endorsing this religious message, and then there's no question the college does have a problem.
I mean, that's what I meant to say at Scratch the Surface, because oftentimes when we hear about or when something is defended as, a spontaneous or a private religious message of a speaker that, the school can't control, just a little poking and prodding kind of reveals that the school oftentimes knows exactly what to expect or in some way sort of scheduled or intended or knew that religious content would be that speaker's end goal. So it's not always cut and dry when we're learning about a spontaneous religious remark at a graduation at any level.
Yeah.
But I guess I should definitely tell Annie Laurie's story, which is...
I was just going to bring that up myself.
Annie Laurie Gaylor, who is the co-president of FFRF, when she was a college student at UW, she herself raised a complaint about prayer at her graduation, and it was a thing where it was kind of as a matter of course. Part of the ceremony was an invocation, and she objected and was told that I think it was student government. It was a student body of government that sort of controlled the commencement programming, so take it up with them. So she went to a student government meeting and kind of made her case. This is just exclusionary, it's wrong, this is a public college, let's not do it. And basically it was a thing where everyone was like, well, it's just always been done this way, we never thought about it differently, but okay. And that was it. There hasn't been prayer at UW commencement since then, and that was in the 70s.
Right. And it is definitely a story of the power of activism, and I thank her for that because 20-some years later, when I graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, my graduation ceremony was wholly secular. So thanks, Annie Laurie, for that. So another question, Paul Rasmussen asks, beyond having to stop a practice, have any schools actually been punished?
Yeah, so, gee, the imagination That was wild. I don't know what punished looks like. School districts have certainly been sued by us and other organizations over their unwillingness to stop praying at graduation and other school-sponsored events. So I guess they've been punished in the sense that they have lost lawsuits and been required to pay attorney's fees for the other side and their own attorney's fees.
And they have to operate under a court order that if they violate, they're going to get in even more trouble. So that's a burden they have to deal with moving forward.
Right. So they're not going to jail or anything like that, but if they violate a court order, they could be held in contempt and subject to fines or jail time for that.
Yeah, but typically when we take when we take some kind of action, what we're looking for is just quick resolution to the situation where the school looks into the law and says, okay, we will stop. Again, as we said before, there's a Supreme Court case directly on point. So when they look at Levy-Weissman, they're going to say, okay, we need to stop this if we don't want to get sued and lose. So typically they say we're not going to do it anymore, and unless we hear that they're not living up to that promise, then the situation's over. So they don't get punished typically, but the issue is resolved.
Right, and I guess it's how you define punishment too, because in some communities where this tradition has been going on for a long time, just the act of stopping is punishment for the community as a whole, so they say. So another question from Leah Reinhardt. Do you get any cases about school-sponsored prayer from minority religions in America, like Islam?
So like an Islam prayer at a graduation. Well, certainly that is less rare. I mean, more rare, less common, because usually the dominant and majority religion in a community is not Islam. It's usually Christianity. I'm trying to think, just kind of scanning my brain for any prayers that have been non-Christian or a minority faith.
I think not
at a graduation.
Not at a graduation ceremony. I mean, we've fielded complaints about Muslim students who have sought room to do Friday prayers and tried to seek accommodations and things like that for fasting during the month of Ramadan. So we've done that, but I've never heard of a graduation prayer that has been directed at any god other than Jesus.
Yeah, and I've written on teachers who promote Islam. I think usually they think they're trying to kind of provide balance because they're probably in a school atmosphere that is promoting Christianity, and so they kind of feel like, well, if they're doing that, I should be able to do that too. And of course, when we get that complaint, we handle it just like we would any other complaint, because we're equal opportunity atheists. But but it's pretty rare. Usually, in my experience, by the time the school district gets our letter saying we received this complaint that one of your teachers is promoting Islam, the mob has usually, the local community has usually already shut it down by that point. Like once word gets out that this has happened, it's over. And that's why I don't think you're likely to encounter it at a graduation prayer, because you would probably, the mic would probably immediately be cut and there would just be,
Right.
The torches are going to come out.
Right, and just keep in mind when we're talking about prayer at a graduation ceremony, we're talking about scheduled prayer that is an official part of the ceremony. That means the powers that be in the school district or at the school sort of have institutionalized this as part of the ceremony. So that means it's going to take the form of whatever the majority religious tradition is in that district. Usually that's Christian. It makes no damn difference to us. If you are in a district where Islam is the majority religion and that's what's scheduled, and you encounter a scheduled prayer that's from a minority religion, please report that to us and we will gladly complain, because that's equally unconstitutional.
I mean, I even got, this is going slightly off topic, but I even got the Dalai Lama removed, so to speak, he had an event across the street from where we are, actually. He had an event at a public building, and they were going to close it to everyone else and have this exclusive Dalai Lama event. And so it's just like, this is endorsing a religious figure. You can't do that. So yeah, we'll go after even religious figures and minority religions that are quite popular among secularists, like the Dalai Lama.
Yes. So we have a few more questions. It looks like one of our colleagues is on his lunch break tuning in. Colin asks, who does have standing to challenge the National Day of Prayer?
Oh, geez.
No one.
Thanks, Colin.
I mean, I think that is what came out of the Seventh Circuit decision, that nobody has challenged, or nobody has standing to challenge the prayer except the president, who is the one who's forced to issue this proclamation. So if we were to get an atheist president who said, actually, I don't want to issue this proclamation, he could probably, or she, excuse me, could probably challenge. But that's what was so frustrating about the Seventh Circuit decision. A proclamation, by its essence, is to proclaim to all citizens. So you would think intuitively that means any citizen to whom the proclamation is supposed to reach should have standing to challenge. But the court said no.
Yeah, and it's a sad thing about this legal fantasy of standing that you encounter in con law and environmental law, and that's about it. That there have been cases where where courts have actually just explicitly said probably no one has standing to challenge this, even though it's the merits are crystal clear. There's just nobody who is in a position where the courts are going to say, yes, you're the right plaintiff for this case. So welcome to our nightmare.
Right.
Right.
So Evie O'Keefe asks, did you say that Focus on the Family sponsors the National Day of Prayer? Aren't they considered a hate group for some of their rabidly anti-LGBTQ rhetoric?
Yes and yes. They so Focus on the Family, I don't know if it's Focus on the Family as is, or if it's just sort of a evangelical group within Focus on the Family. I'm not even sure who now is at the helm. It used to be
the Dobsons,
and now I'm not sure who it is. Someone carrying on the legacy of the Dobsons at Focus on the Family, and those same evangelicals also created the National Day of Prayer Task Force, which is a private organization or entity, but yes, it sort of works. It's completely elevated by the fact that it has the proclamation. I mean, doesn't have, I don't know what force of law, but just the power of the presidential office behind it, and all of these smaller government offices like governor's offices, mayor's offices, that all participate in this first Thursday in May tradition of the National Day of Prayer. So the task force is sort of a private organization, but yes, it's all sort of part and parcel of the same National Day of Prayer that's involved in the proclamation and the statutes that Rebecca talked about earlier. And yes, I do think Focus on the Family has been identified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you can read all about that probably by Googling it.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of similar to, like, we write on See You at the Pole, which is a fall school prayer event that a private group picks a theme each year and just kind of like sends it out to everyone. And so at public schools, they say this is the theme. And so all across the country, you have this prayer event that's dedicated to a particular theme that a private group has set up. Of course, that's different because there we have much clearer laws in a public school, and so if the public school is participating in any way, they are in hot water immediately, whereas the National Day of Prayer, again, we have some legal hurdles to deal with. But it's the same situation where you have a private group that's just sending the message to government agencies, essentially saying, this is how this year's event's going to run, and then in the case of National Day of Prayer, you have just tons of cities and towns that are going to just run with that.
Right. That just reminded me, though, just running off of that, there might be a situation where, because it's the National Day of Prayer tomorrow, and it's very well known, and lots of government actors sort of want to use their position to do something for the National Day of Prayer, you may see a National Day of Prayer event in your local public school. If it's in any way sponsored by, organized by, promoted by the school or the district or school staff, that's definitely something we would want to complain about. Just like See You at the Pole or any other private event, it's a religious event, and the schools should not be involved in any way in a National Day of Prayer event. So that's another thing that can be reported to us. And spring is fun.
So we do have one more question. Eric Thorson asks, I was reading that Paul Ryan forced the White House chaplain to resign.
Oh boy.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
We do.
Are chaplains even legal since they are endorsing a government-sponsored religion? Oh, complicated answer, Eric.
Yeah. That's a whole show unto itself. But yes, we would definitely agree that the entire Congressional Chaplaincy violates the Establishment Clause. Unfortunately, congressional chaplaincies have been upheld by the Supreme Court in a case from the 80s, Marsh v. Chambers, and chaplaincies have sort of gotten some support from courts throughout our history. But let's see. So Pat Conroy, the current chaplain, right now we actually have a lawsuit against him and Paul Ryan in the House of Reps called Barker v. Conroy and soon to be Barker v. someone else, maybe, because of the chaplain, the congressional chaplain or the House chaplain's only actual duty, and you can kind of Google Pat Conroy, FFRF, and read all about the exorbitant amount of taxpayer money that goes to his one duty, which is to lead open sessions of the House with a prayer. And what he really does, probably the majority of the time, or maybe at least half the time, is coordinates guest chaplains to come in and take that honor and open a house session with prayer. You may have read as part of this scandal, one of the many whispered reasons why he might have been axed is because of him inviting a certain minority religious prayer giver. I don't remember if it was Muslim.
I think it was Muslim, yeah.
So anyway, that's what part of what he does is coordinate guest chaplains to come in and deliver prayers before a session. Dan Barker applied through our representative here in Madison, Wisconsin, which is Mark Pocan. He, with a legislative sponsor, which is pursuant to the rules, he applied to be one of those guest chaplains and deliver an invocation, a secular invocation, opening a session. And basically, the chaplain's office, Conroy's office, said no, ultimately, after a lot of back and forth, and so we sued. So that's sort of a complicated lawsuit that's not exactly a constitutional challenge to the chaplaincy, but it's just sort of a new way that we've been challenging the exclusionary effect of having, yes, a Christian chaplaincy at the seat of congressional power. I mean, and of course, as you've probably read, since this has been in the news, in our nation's history, there has never been a non-Christian, non-male chaplain, congressional chaplain, and so, yes, here we are.
When it makes, it makes me wonder if, even though it's just speculation that was any part of the reason that he got fired, if it was that he let one Islamic prayer in the door, can you imagine if he had let not only an atheist give the invocation, but also an atheist from Madison, Wisconsin, which is right down the street from Janesville, where Paul Ryan's from? I think that probably would have, he would have gotten fired on the spot, perhaps.
Right.
Well, I think this resignation or firing is calling into question the wisdom of even having a chaplain. I know there are a lot of even religious people who are like, why do we even have this in Congress? Is it necessary? So good questions to be asked,
it's
even in the
a great time
public.
to have that conversation,
Right.
So like legality of it aside, this is a wonderful time to just bring up to say, hey, let's just agree not to do this because it just doesn't make any sense, even if it's legal.
Right, and of course the circus and just the politics that it's creating right now in the controversy in the media, and is just a perfect illustration of the point, which is religion and government should be kept separate for a reason. And, I don't know what comes out looking worse in this, religion or politics, but it's probably everybody.
Right. So we don't have any more questions. That's it for this week's Ask an Atheist. If you encounter violations regarding the National Day of Prayer tomorrow or upcoming public school graduations, you can submit them to FFRF at our website. And be sure to join Dan Barker and others next Wednesday at noon Central for another edition of FFRF's Ask an Atheist, and they'll be discussing whether Jesus existed. Have a great week.